McGraw-Hill, Living with Art, 13th edition, Part 5, Chapter 17, The 17th and 18th Centuries. Chapter outline: The Baroque Era, the 18th century in Europe, the Americas in the 18th century. The Baroque Era. Baroque art is characterized by emotion, energy, movement, theatricality, bright color, foreshortening, diagonal lines, and extremes of light and dark. The Baroque Era. Bernini used architecture, painting, sculpture, and light to create drama. Bernini would have been a fascinating character in any age, but if ever an artist and a style were perfectly suited for each other, this was true of Bernini and the Baroque. Largely for his own pleasure, he was a painter, dramatist, and composer. In architecture and sculpture, however, his gifts were prodigious. Bernini's talents are on full display in the Cornano Chapel in the Church of Santa Maria del Vittoria in Rome. In a small funeral chapel for the Cardinal Federico Cornaro, Bernini integrated architecture, painting, sculpture, and lighting into a brilliant ensemble. Under a ceiling painted as a vision of heaven, sculpted figures of the Cornano family sit in animated conversation, witnessing the miraculous vision depicted in Bernini's Saint Teresa in Ecstasy. Teresa was a Spanish mystic, founder of a strict order of nuns, an important figure in the Catholic Counter-Reformation. She claimed to have experienced religious trances in which she saw visions of heaven and hell and was visited by angels. Bernini used architecture, painting, sculpture, and lighting to create drama. Bernini decorated the interior of St. Peter's. His baldacchino marks the location of the main altar. Made of cast bronze, it stands under Michelangelo's immense dome and above the tomb of St. Peter, considered the first pope of the Roman Catholic Church. Meant to simulate an horrific canopy, the baldacchino rests on 4 twisting Solomonic columns, so called because they were inspired by columns from the ancient Temple of Solomon. Their dynamic shape creates movement that is echoed by dramatically posed angels and tall volutes that come together nearly 100 feet above the altar. A cross resting on a globe appears at the very top to proclaim the Catholic Church's victory over the challenges of the Protestant Reformation. Beyond the baldacchino, Bernini offered an even more theatrical statement of papal victory by surrounding St. Peter's throne with an eruption of angels, clouds, and rays of divine light, using carved and gilded wood. The Baroque Era. Baroque architecture used plan, lighting, and illusion to focus viewers' attention. One of the great projects of Baroque Rome was the completion of St. Peter's, which had been designed by Michelangelo. During the early 17th century, architect Carlo Maderno transformed Michelangelo's central plan into a basilica. With the extension of the east side of the church, Maderno created a nave. The new access allowed for more dramatic processions and accommodated greater numbers of visitors, who could enter side chapels without disturbing religious services. The nave also added drama to the interior, focusing attention on and drawing visitors toward the main altar at the far end of the church. To match the majesty of Maderno's plan, Bernini decorated the interior of St. Peter's. Outside St. Peter's, Bernini designed a spectacular colonnade, or row of columns, to enclose the vast square in front of the church. The site was challenging, already containing an obelisk and fountains that Bernini was required to accommodate. His solution solved the problem and another: the distance of the obelisk and the fountains from the church's facade. Bernini created a dynamic oval to contain the existing objects and a trapezoid to condense the space between the oval and the facade. This creates the illusion that the church is closer to the oval than it really is, as seen in later etchings. From a bird's-eye perspective, the colonnade seems to form two huge arms that embrace visitors to one of the Christendom's holiest sites. Visitors walking through the colonnade into the square, even today, feel as if they have left the mundane world and entered into a sacred space. The Baroque era. Baroque art was interpreted differently throughout Europe with realistic, exuberant, and classical approaches. Artemizini Degenteleschi's painting Judith and Maidservant with the head of Holofernes, the artist's subject comes from the biblical story of Judith. According to scripture, Judith, a pious and beautiful Israelite widow, volunteered to rescue her people from the invading armies of the Assyrian general Holofernes. She charmed the general, accepted his invitation to a banquet, and waited until he drank himself into a stupor. She then calmly beheaded him, wrapped his head in a sack, and escaped. Other Gelantini's paintings show the decapitation in progress. Here the artist focused on the moments after the glory deed. Judith stands with arms twisting across her body, one hand still clutching the bloody sword, the other poised in a gesture of silence. The only light comes from a candle that illuminates Judith and her maid, with the rest of the scene in darkness. The pair is organized on a diagonal rising from the bottom right to the upper left, hemmed by a curtain and table. These Baroque devices heighten the sense of danger and urgency in the moment depicted. Although Baroque artistic principles were taken up across Europe, each country developed them in their own way. The Flemish artist Peter Paul Rubens painted in a particularly exuberant and dynamic Baroque style. Rubens had traveled to Italy and studied the works of Italian masters, including Michelangelo and Caravaggio. He also visited and worked for several royal courts, including Paris, where he created a series of 24 monumental paintings of the life of the Queen Mother, Marie de Medici. The purpose of the paintings was to celebrate the French monarchy and Marie's right to rule following the death of her husband, Henry IV. In the canvas seen here, Henry receives a portrait of his betrothed, Marie, held aloft by Cupid and the god of marriage. The goddess Minerva speaks in the king's ear, telling him about Marie's virtues, while the king and queen of the gods, Jupiter and Juno, look on approvingly from the heavens. Although the French monarchy appreciated Rubens' exuberant approach, French artists favored a more restrained or classical version of Baroque style. The order and balance of the Renaissance were retained, though infused with a new theatrical and grandeur, even in the landscape paintings. The Baroque interest in classical themes is also interpreted in Velázquez's painting The Feast of Bacchus, also known as The Merry Troopers. Yet the Spanish painter's treatment of the god of wine is far from the heroic idealization of Rubens' Jupiter. Velázquez instead chose to represent the god as a pale young man with a soft physique. His companions are not the nymphs or satyrs of Greek and Rome lore. They instead look familiar to us, as if Velázquez found his models in the local saloon. Their humble clothes and rosy cheeks and drooping eyes convince us of their inebriation. This realism humanizes the subject. The Baroque era. Absolute monarchs used court artists, art, and architecture to promote their rule. Absolute monarchs used court artists, art, and architecture to promote their rule. Example 1 of the ways in which absolute monarchs used court artists, art, and architecture to promote their rule. Rubens' Baroque style is seen in the grand diagonal composition that links the kings to the gods above. The colors are vivid and saturated with reds, blues, and golds repeated to unify the image. The play of light and shadow is dramatic, with bright highlights giving way to deeper shadows than the sunny day would seem to produce. Textures glisten from the silk garments worn by Minerva and Juno to Henry's hard metal armor. With their garments, each figure possesses a heroic physique. Jupiter and Juno are particularly robust, and their theatrically staged drapery cascades out onto the rolling clouds nearby. The entire painting seems to quiver with potential energy and movement, despite its quiet theme. A king's godlike power is on display in this huge portrait, which pictures the king standing in his throne room, dominating the composition. A curtain is pulled back to reveal the regal position and the symbols of his right to rule. The ermine robe that cascades around him bears the fleur-de-lis symbol of France. The scepter in the king's hand and the crown resting beside it signify royal authority, while the sword on the king's hip shows his might. The king is himself the perfect example of rulership as he gazes confidently out of the painting. He is dressed in the fashionable clothing that he promoted at court, including the shoes with heels. Rigaud's treatment of texture creates an almost tangible impression of the soft ermine and the stiff gold brocade threads of his garment. Colors are rich and dramatically contrasted, with complementary reds, blues, and golds framing the monarch's person. The theatrical lighting highlights the king, while everything else recedes into the shadows. The view here shows a central portion of the palace, overlooking the fountains and gardens that stretch for more than 4 miles. Sculpture such as the resting river god in this photograph represents classical themes meant to symbolize the king's power. The exterior of the palace also reflects the continuing classical tendencies of France, with a vocabulary of arches, columns, and entablatures. The Baroque era. Baroque themes included classical antiquity, genre scenes, still life, and landscapes. Working in the southern Spanish city of Sevilla, Murillo represented a girl and her chaperone in the genre painting, a scene of everyday life. The girl looks confidently and curiously out the trompe-l'oeil window at the world outside. The dark background projects her into our space, and the theatrical light models her figure and accentuates the textures of her blouse and hair. Although Murillo's genre subjects display familiar behaviors and convincing three-dimensionality, his characters are never quite real. They are instead idealized types, unlike the rustic characters of Velázquez. The Dutch Baroque, sometimes called the bourgeois Baroque, is quite different from the Baroque movements of France, Spain, and Italy. In the north, Protestantism was the dominant religion, and the outward symbols of faith, imagery, ornate churches, and the clerical pageantry were far less important. Dutch society, and particularly the wealthy merchant class, centered not on the church, but instead on home and family, business and social organizations, and the community. In addition to group portraits and genre scenes, Dutch artists made many still life paintings. These works, which picture only assembled fruits, foods, or other objects, were very popular with Dutch patrons. Paintings such as this amaze us with their detail and realistic renderings of common items arrayed across the table. Water drips from the grapes and leaves begin to curl with age, and spots form on the ripe fruit. Van der Denenst, the artist, was one of a group of artists who specialized in still life paintings, and he gained particular fame for including shells, insects, and lizards among his flowers. The Baroque era, Dutch Baroque art reflected Protestant ideals about art and the interest of the merchant class. This painting portrays a kind of private elite militia. Such groups have played a prominent role in defending the cities against the recent wars against Spanish domination, although by Rembrandt's time their function was largely ceremonial. These companies were still widely respected, and all of the most important men in town belonged to one. Dutch civic organizations often commissioned group portraits, and painters usually responded by portraying the members seated around a table or lined up for the 17th century equivalent of a class photograph. Rembrandt's innovation was to paint individual portraits within the context of a larger activity, a call to arms. This makes the painting both a portrait and a genre painting. The declining role of overly religious art in Protestant society led prosperous Dutch merchants to commission still life paintings like Van der Ernst for their homes. These paintings were not only beautiful and engaging, but also demonstrated the patron's wealth. While some still life paintings are filled with humble objects, many pictures tables covered in valuable items from around the world. Van der Ernst's paintings includes 2 examples of Chinese porcelain, a plate and a vase. These objects were acquired through trade with Asia and signaled the Dutch overseas trade activity. The 17th century was also a great period for landscape painting in the Netherlands. The Dutch were proud of having taken their new nation back from Spanish control, as well as the feats of engineering that kept the land from being swamped by the ocean. Typical of Dutch landscape painting was the work of Jacob van Ruysdael, which pictures the land and the quiet spirituality of Dutch society. The 18th century in Europe. 18th century European art has been divided into Rococo and Neoclassical periods. The 18th century in Europe. Rococo art reflects aristocratic interest and is characterized by sophistication, ornament, pastel colors, complicated compositions, and light, playful themes. Cytherea is the mythological island of love. Watteau specialized in scenes in which aristocratic men and women gather in the leafy setting to play at love. The Rococo style of architecture originated in France, but was soon exported. We find some of the most developed examples in Germany, and especially in Bavaria. This church demonstrates amply why the word Rococo has come to mean elaborate and profuse. Designed by Neumann, the church is a riot of sinuous, twisting architectural and decorative forms. Every line moves, curls, and twists back on itself. Scrolls and plant forms adorn the enlivened surfaces. The light and analogous hues and throughout the buildings are soft and pleasant, even in the paintings on the ceiling. The serious drama of the Baroque has given way to a theatrical, joyful playfulness. Rococo was, above all, a sophisticated style. The king's mistress, Countess du Barry, commissioned one of the last masterpieces of Rococo art. Through a lushly overgrown garden in the grounds of some imaginary estate, an ardent youth climbs a garden wall to join the girl who has captured his heart. The object of his affection twists her body to make sure that no one is watching, holding out her hand to pause the young man's progress. Above, a statue of Venus and Cupid reinforces the painting's romantic subject. The painting's complex composition, small details, use of light, an analogous pastel color scheme of blues, greens, and yellows, contrasted with bits of pink and red, typify the Rococo style. The 18th century in Europe. The Rococo style extended to crafts, some influenced by forms from China. Inspired by the Chinese wares flooding into Europe via overseas trade, Mizines developed the first porcelain production in Europe. Its white vessels were formed into fanciful shapes and decorated in gold or colorful enamel paint. Many of the images painted onto Mizines objects were inspired by Chinese motifs. This teapot scene with the figures and animals and landscape reflect European interpretations of Chinese images. The shape of the pot likely derives from European mythology. A nude female forms the handle, and the spout is a beast held by a godlike male character. His helmet, topped by a frog, serves as the pot's lid. We can imagine how ornate a host table appeared when outfitted with a full set of cups and saucers that once accompanied this teapot. The 18th century in Europe. Neoclassical art is characterized by seriousness, clarity, and forms reflecting classical art, and promoted patriotism, stoicism, self-sacrifice, and simplicity. The Rococo style had run its course. Seriousness was now in vogue, together with an artistic style called neoclassicism, or new classicism. Since 1748, excavations at the Roman sites of Pompeii in Italy had been uncovering wonders such as the wall paintings we looked at in chapter 14. Patrons and artists across Europe were fascinated by the classical past, and their interest was encouraged by the rulers and social thinkers hoping to foster civic engagement and virtues such as patriotism, stoicism, self-sacrifice, and frugality, virtues they associated with the Roman Republic. Gone are the lush gardens and the pastel colors of the Rococo. In their place, this artist, David, conceived of an austere architectural setting beyond which there is merely darkness. Spread across the shadow foreground space, the dramatically lit figures are portrayed in profile, as though carved in relief. The composition is orderly and stable, with the father serving as the central axis. The creamy brushstrokes and hazy atmosphere of the Farragon have given way to smooth finish and cool, clear light. The colors are muted, except for the father's tunic, which flows like a river of blood next to the three gleaming swords. Along with the stern Roman family values promoted by neoclassicism, the late 18th century was under the spell of a new taste for simplicity and naturalness. One of the people most taken by the new informality was Queen Marie Antoinette, and another advocate of all that was unaffected was the Queen's favorite portrait painter, Elizabeth van Guy-Leyburn. Although her Marie Antoinette and her children painting, as we see in this slide, promotes solemnity over informality in an attempt to repair the Queen's reputation for being frivolous and flirtatious. The painter painted the Queen as a devoted and beloved mother. She is a woman who sees her place in the home, not meddling in politics or advertising her charms. In a gesture meant to tug at the viewer's heartstrings, her elder son, the heir to the throne, draws our attention to an empty cradle. His youngest sibling had recently died in infancy. The Queen's formal velvet gown and the glimpse of the fabled Hall of Mirrors in the background are meant to convey that she is aware of the seriousness of her position and fully capable of the quiet dignity needed to fulfill it. Painting in the late 18th century, England came to be dominated by the Royal Academy in London, which promoted a style inspired by classical art and works by Renaissance and Baroque masters. The Academy's first president, Sir Joshua Reynolds, painted portraits in a style that has come to be known as grand manner, for its opulent backgrounds and poses drawn from classical art. Like many grand manner portraits, Reynolds' Lady Sarah Burgundy sacrificing to the Graces is life-sized, and we are made to look up at its subjects. She wears a gown inspired by ancient Roman clothing and makes an offering to a sculpture of the three Graces, the daughters of Zeus, and symbols of her own admirable qualities. While the painting shares some of the softness and lightness of the French and German Rococo style, its composition is more stable and its subjects much less frivolous. The Americas in the 18th century. 18th century art made in the Americas represented colonial history. The Americas in the 18th century. American artists painted in the neoclassical style and included American values in their works. British settlements along the east coast of today's United States had grown to 13 colonies with 2.5 million residents. Most colonists lived with plain, unadorned furniture, reflecting the religious conservatism of the early settlers, although Rococo motifs appeared in wealthier homes. The art hanging on walls included realistic portraits without artifice to suit the taste of their patrons. By the mid-18th century, cities like Boston and Philadelphia had thriving artist communities. Several painters from the colonies even crossed the Atlantic, studying art during tours of Europe and settling in England. In 1771, the son of Pennsylvania colony founder William Penn commissioned a painting to honor the treaty his father signed in 1682 with the Lenni Lenape people. Benjamin West, then working in London as a member of the Royal Academy, painted Penn's treaty with the Indians as a major historical event. Penn stands with arms open just left of the center, surrounded by members of his Quaker community. Members of the Lenni Lenape people appear on the right, listening to Penn's proposal and looking at the gifts the settlers offer in trade for their land. Like David's image of Horati, West neoclassical painting puts the action in a shallow foreground, with the figures in an orderly circle. The bustling town in the background and the figures to either side frame the action and focus our attention. Also, like David's work, West's presentation of history is more allegorical than factual, creating the illusion of a fair and open negotiation between Penn and the Lenni Lenape people, when in reality colonial settlers' treatment of indigenous populations was far from equitable. In 1776, Britain's colonies in the United States declared independence. The colonist war against British rule was led by George Washington, who became the new nation's first president. Charles Wilson Peale painted Washington's portrait, while the fighting still raged. The painting captures an image of an American leader. The flags of the British military units Washington defeated at the Battle of Princeton lie at his feet as the vanquished soldiers are led from the battlefield by his troops. On the right side of the painting is an assembly of symbols of the general's military might. The new American flag flies above a page leading a horse. Both direct their attention towards their leader, who leans against the cannon. Washington dominates the composition, a pillar of strength silhouetted against a stormy sky that is clearing. We may compare his confident, casual pose and direct gaze to Louis IV's family formality and haughty superiority. Unlike the godlike, absolute monarch, however, Washington appears as both a hero and a common man. The Americas in the 18th century. Spanish colonial authorities used art to represent American diversity under Spanish rule and loyalty to Spain. Unlike the British settlers in North America who pushed indigenous populations off their land, Spanish colonists imposed themselves atop existing native communities who, along with Africans brought to the Americas as enslaved persons, were expected to convert to Christianity and to assimilate as citizens of the Spanish Empire. By the 18th century, the Spanish colonies were filled with diverse peoples subject to race-based laws created to preserve the privilege of the Spanish colonizers who sat atop a racial hierarchy known as the caste system. Juan Patricio Morlete Rousset's painting belongs to a series of paintings picturing racial diversity in the colony of New Spain, today's Mexico. Using skin tone and dress, Morlete Rousset's canvases present stereotyped figures in landscape settings, with a father of one race, a mother of another, and their mixed-race child, shown alongside descriptive labels and fruits and vegetables native to the Americas. The family groups in a series were painted to calm European anxieties about the orderliness of diverse colonial societies. Though far from the reality of daily life, Morlete-Rousset's idealized images proclaim that all citizens of the colonies lived harmoniously under the rule of the Spanish king. As the 18th century ended, the Spanish king approved the creation of a Royal Art Academy in New Spain. Staffed by faculty brought from Spain, the Academy's goal was to improve local artistic production. Manuel Tolsa's equestrian sculpture of Charles IV was part of a renovation of Mexico City's main square intended to celebrate the king and promote the Academy's neoclassical style. Tolosa drew upon the familiar symbolism that European monarchs used to represent their power, and was inspired by the equestrian portrait of Marcus Aurelius. The Spanish king appears in the cast bronze portrait dressed as a Roman general with his hand raised in a commanding gesture. In reality, Charles IV never wore a costume like this, nor did he lead troops in battle. Nevertheless, Tolstoy took a page from neoclassical works to represent virtue and leadership. Unfortunately for the Spanish monarchs, residents of the new colonies soon rebelled, like those in the United States and France, to fight for independence in the early 19th century. The era of absolutism had come to an end. This concludes Chapter 17.